All right. So these last 2 weeks, I think we read through chapters 10, 11, and 12. I think we are kind of into the Middle Kingdom period. We started off the first chapter by looking at the line of rulers that preceded the expulsion of the Hyksos rulers, which had invaded Egypt for some time. So being liberated from that, we see, as the chapter 10 title implies, order was reimposed in the Egyptian kingdom. So, we also see, I think, in the next chapter, Pushing the Boundaries, we see that there was a significant female ruler, Hatshepsut, I think is her name, was the daughter of a great military leader. I think it was Thutmose the First. So instead of going into the details, which each one of you should have more or less become familiar with through reading these chapters, we're going to take a look at some of the things we had written here on the board, some comprehension questions, kind of in the same way we did it last time, and then see if we can provoke any discussion from there. So who wrote the first question there?
I did.
Okay, you want to read it for us and then we'll think about it?
Why did the locals of Kerma reaffirm religious activities in defiance of the rulers?
This is why did locals of Kerma reaffirm religious activities in defiance of their rulers? So can you remind us what Kerma was? Was that a place or a town? Or?
Yeah, it was a town in the Middle Age of Egypt. I don't really remember. I wrote this a long time ago, so I don't really remember exactly where it was.
Okay. Does anyone have a answer to the question? Maybe? Or thoughts on the question before Elijah goes into it?
I have not read this book, so
okay.
Let's go ahead.
Elijah, go ahead and give us your answer.
Well, I think it was because they, for one, didn't accept the way that their rulers ruled, obviously, and you can. This is just kind of one example of how a lot of things like this have happened in history where people don't agree with the rulers, and they don't accept them, and they do things, and it's usually just the people, not even people of high standing in the government or rulership. It's the people who follow who will turn against the higher rulings.
The ruling class?
Yeah, and in this example of the locals of Kerma, they reaffirmed, which means like redirected or changed.
Reaffirm would be more like reestablish something that was before, I think.
Right. They reaffirmed these religious activities, I think, in defiance of their current rulers by bringing up old ways of doing things, because it was a reaffirming of previous religion.
Would you by any chance have like the reference or source of this particular question in the last?
In chapter 2 somewhere.
You mean chapter 11?
Oh, second chapter. I mean that we read.
Okay.
That would be
lunch.
Chapter 11.
What?
Okay.
Lunch?
So I don't know where.
Oh no,
Lunch.
Benji got
He's
him some
gonna
lunch.
I wrote this almost like 2 weeks ago. So
Why don't you with us?
Because he didn't have lunch, so Dad brought him some.
We can eat our lunch.
He's just gonna eat it after his food.
I wrote this almost 2 weeks ago, so I'm kind of rusty on where everything is. I'm sorry.
All right.
What, hold on. What is the laughing matter for? I was thinking you should eat with us. Don't let your dad drive him crazy, drive all the way to pick your lunch up.
Yeah, he's such a good father.
He's a good father, but he would like to
Patient with
do
me,
that.
that's for sure.
Okay, next time he wants to be the father, said, "Oh, I'm hungry. We eat lunch."
We all eat lunch.
A good brother. Goes from a father to a brother.
And the second thing is that if your father cannot attend, they don't have lunch for you. I'll have fast food there. There's noodle there. It's a
Oh,
mix
yeah.
some noodle.
Sure.
I mean, at least fill your stomach. So,
Thank you.
yeah. As she knows.
Yeah. Anyways, I kind of wrote this as the question for history, and also kind of what Justin was saying last time for like spiritual reasons. And for that, I kind of have the reasoning of how we as people, as said followers of God, will many times reaffirm our. I think I was thinking of the example of the familiar spirit, of how like people, we will reaffirm
Always.
old ways of doing things and may not see it, but it is in defiance of the Lord, because
Oh.
reaffirming old ways, especially familiar ways that are not good ways, that will become a defiance to the Father.
Yeah.
That's the example I had for that.
Spiritual application of that.
Yeah.
It's just a perspective. I like it.
So I do see here near the beginning of that chapter you're talking about, where Tutmos the first came up to Kerma, which was at that time the capital of the Kushite kingdom. So those were enemies of the Egyptians in the south, in their southern regions, which in that case would be Upper Egypt. And we come to an interesting scene here that's described, in which the future queen Hepzibah, whatever her name is,
So,
yeah,
I don't know.
Hatshepsut or whatever, she was present as a young princess in this particular scene. But they come up to this large quartz rock. Is this what you're referencing to?
I don't know.
They come up to, and it was like a great quartz rock that had a very keen religious significance for the Kushite people. So there were carvings all around it to begin with, but then this king Tutmos the first comes up and carves his own statement of rulership into
Yeah, I think
the
that's
quartz rock.
I think that's what it was based around.
Okay.
Can you believe that? We read Isaiah 11, Cushite. Let's see, Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt. Yeah, goodness, sorry.
But yeah, I thought that is actually an interesting event to consider and discuss, because, like he mentions here near the bottom of page 204.
204? Okay.
Yeah. It says, returning to Kerma, the king looked upon the devastation that his army had wrought, and true to form, resolved to memorialize the crushing victory in yet another monumental inscription. And it mentions here in parentheses, the power of the written word to render permanent a desired state of affairs lay at the heart of Egyptian belief and practice. So this, of course, serves as a great example of this. Carved into the side of an imposing sloping rock just outside the city limits, near modern Tombos, the text gives an extensive commentary on the Nubian campaign. So that goes on there.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah, rock there, that's right.
let's see here. I was trying to look in your example, Elijah, to see what you were talking about when you said that Kerma, so this is the place or the town, affirmed their religious activities it's not. I don't see it described in that particular example, but maybe it is later on in this chapter.
Yeah, I
Just so we can better understand what you were asking.
didn't copy paste it, but I basically said what it said in the book. So I know it was something to do with Gil Crone.
Okay. So yeah, I also appreciate the spiritual principle that you drew there, and how essentially Kerma establishing their own religious practices in defiance of the rulership of Egypt as a sort of parallel to perhaps mankind's own tendency to do so to God. Okay. So why don't we move on to the second question then? Who wrote that one?
That was mine.
That's yours, Benji?
Yes, I think so. Yep. Do you want me to read it out?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Were all female pharaohs married, and why did they entitle the place of a pharaoh instead of their husbands?
Okay. So this one, so far, I mean, I think we're getting close to about halfway through a review of ancient Egyptian history, and I'm trying to remember how many female pharaohs we've come across. We certainly looked at one in this reading. And it did mention other very influential women in ancient Egypt of royal blood, though most of them were not considered actual pharaohs. As it relates to your question, or you actually kind of asked two questions here. Were all female pharaohs married? Do you want to go ahead and answer that for us, that first question?
Well, it kind of leads to another question that I also had was, like, almost, were they in need of a pharaoh so much that they took the only, because maybe there wasn't, like, any male descent
Sure.
in their royal blood at the time, and they needed someone to rule.
So in many ways, it kind of depends on circumstance.
Yeah, I was just wondering if that might be a big part in what plays this, or maybe yeah, one of the big decisions that led to that. But
Right.
I think some of them were married, right? But
Okay.
maybe they married not of royal blood,
Sure.
or someone that wasn't.
Yeah, we saw in Hatshepsut's case that it was actually a really awkward scenario because according to the kind of psyche behind Egyptian rulership, especially as it relates to divine kingship, that it almost 100% necessarily required that the ruler be male,
Mm-hmm.
because it was kind of a age-old patriarchal system of a kind.
Right.
And so she almost made a series of, I guess you could call them compromises in order to kind of work along with that. So as we saw, that she made statues of herself almost with a purposefully male appearance. I think we read that.
Yeah.
In order to adhere to this male idea of divine kingship. And so she almost wasn't considered a queen. She was still considered a king. So that's what it meant to be, at least in this time, that's what it meant to be a pharaoh. In the same way, she almost adopted certain male characteristics of certain Egyptian gods, but at the same time, she also highlighted and emphasized woman, or even womanized, I guess you could say, certain Egyptian gods as well. And it was kind of like this back and forth series of compromises in order to make it work as to be a female ruler. So as we can see in Hatshepsut's case, a female pharaoh was a very novel, somewhat disturbing and troublesome thing that was hard, I guess, it just didn't fit with the system of Egyptian rulership, and so that's why it was kind of an, at least as the author here describes it, kind of an awkward scenario. So, did you kind of already answer the second question you asked there, as to why the female rulers took the place of Pharaoh rather than their husbands? You were saying that because I think you were saying it was because perhaps the husbands were not of a royal bloodline.
Yeah.
Did we see whether or not? I don't think Hatshepsut actually had a husband. Did she?
Did she?
Yeah, she did.
Who wasn't? Who
I
was
think
he?
it was
don't remember.
Thutmose. The second.
Thutmose.
Thutmose.
That after her husband's death, there is a stepson.
Yeah, and then there was a son. But
It's
she also had a
in
daughter.
209 the last part. She actually have some explanation.
Yeah, Thutmose II was his was her half brother,
Yeah.
and she was a consort to Thutmose II. Yeah.
She would consider as a wife.
I also remember at one point in the chapter where it was talking about how she was one of the greater of the female leaders, so like there was more.
Mm.
I don't know. That might be chapters that we have yet to read, but
Yeah.
I was just wondering kind of how that worked out.
So yeah, it was after a time that her half brother slash or husband basically, he succumbed, as it says here on page 209. He succumbed to ill health, and therefore she took her chance as kind of the next in line as a ruler.
Right.
And so then we get her interesting case. So yeah, that was kind of a major theme as a part of these 3 chapters we read, specifically, of course, here in chapter 2. So, all right.
Yeah, can we read this part a little bit?
Which part?
It's new to me. It's 210, 210 said, oh, this is king. Where is this thing? Well, I now read the book as I picked up a while ago in here, so
Yeah.
forgive me if it doesn't matter. So, said after the quotation there, her position as God's wife, so she considered somehow through her stepson,
Right.
become God, give her some authority, especially in the Theban region. But Hatshepsut and her courtiers must have been acutely aware that it was not the king's mother, merely his stepmother aunt. For her to exercise full control of the government would require appropriate ideological cover and proper theological justification. So she took certain steps to do that, as you described. First step would adopt the equivalent of a royal throne, which used alongside her queenly title. The 7 years did something determined, irrevocable decision to adopt the full panoply of a kingship. What that means, that word panoply. Do you know anything?
Panoply.
The replica of crowns, scepters. I guess that's basically the things.
I guess the office, or perhaps.
I think the things she can decorate her, like a scepter, like crowns, so that she can endow herself with, basically, so hollow title style of Egyptian monarchy. Also, she shared that with her stepson, basically. Now this is the part. She also threw some gods, and right, so change the gods. Anyway, no one must know better. I was just trying to on the fly reading certain things.
Yeah, I think as kind of the tone of her rulership is kind of set here at the bottom of the same page, where it says, the sleight of hand may have convinced some of her detractors, but there was still the awkward question of her gender. The ideology of kingship demanded a male ruler. And it says, yet Hatshepsut, as her very name announced, was female. Her response to this conundrum was deeply schizophrenic. In some monuments, especially those so it goes on to her attempt to both feminize certain originally male ideologies and religious symbols. At the same time, she masculinized.
Mascularized. Yeah.
Masculinized. That's not the word. I don't know.
Mascularized.
Certain aspects of herself, like in her own statues and stuff.
Is that
So
right?
that's why he described it as schizophrenic, kind of
Yeah.
not consistent, very back and forth, kind of strange.
But also
Yes.
at
in the
one
way
point
that
that
she-
she still was like called lady instead of lord, or
Is that right?
like
Yeah.
it's more female
Uh-huh.
names.
Yeah, so she didn't lean 100% on the side of trying to feminize things,
Yeah.
but she also didn't lean 100% on the side of trying to masculinize.
Mascularize. Do
Goodness.
that good, better than you.
Wait, what did you even say?
Mascularize. Mascularize.
Mascularize. That still doesn't sound right, but it could be right. I don't know.
Okay. I don't know.
All right, so why don't we move on to the third question?
That's fine.
Okay.
Okay, so my question was, what was the importance of being called Pharaoh in Egypt?
Okay, that's a pretty broad question.
Yep. So I don't know why the word kind of intrigued me to study a little bit last night, because it did. So I studied the word a little bit, and I found something kind of interesting about it. So Pharaoh can also mean is like a king and whatever, because they were also called kings before. But Pharaoh stuck because they liked the name better, because it was closer to being known as more of a god, because they thought they were more of gods than kings, because they thought they were like even better than kings.
Mm-hmm.
And the word Pharaoh actually means great house, which is a reference to like the palace where the Pharaoh resides.
Oh wow.
And I just saw this of a very selfish mindset of rule and way of life. And I also saw this correlation with the church being known as like a building when really it is a people.
Yeah.
And my dad and I actually talked this morning about it a little bit, and he was talking about how it also is an example of like how people wanted to do and build their own house in their own way instead of building God's true house.
Yeah.
And they were kind of just doing their own way of rule and stuff.
Yeah.
And we are truly meant to be his sons, working together as a body, separated by like religion or place, but having like a true relationship with God.
Yeah. Mass mind rulership and hierarchy, right? So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rather than like living our own way and letting stuff rule over us.
Yes.
But yeah, I just saw like kind of an interesting correlation there with the meaning of Pharaoh.
Yeah. That's interesting. Me too. This morning I'm thinking about again the picture. The Egyptian has a word called authority, wisdom, whatever. Passed on through the ages as mystical things, hidden wisdom. Always try to rule people, right? So even use a magical power, so they have the connection with the divine or supernatural. So so for the build monuments, erect meaningful structures. Even the destination is not immune, right? Last time, Justin mentioned the dollar bill, and then we see certain things. Like the Washington Monument, what do you think is obvious? Nice, exactly those kind of things. In this nation, Pentagon. Yeah, so I don't want to drive you guys crazy, but that's there. So this is all from Egypt culture. So,
Yep.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the significance of what it meant to be Pharaoh, as we've already seen, and I really wish I could recall exactly when or where in this book it mentions the origin of the word and its meaning, because I know it's in there and we looked at it, but I can't quite remember what it is. But this notion of being a Pharaoh does, as we've already seen, getting halfway through the book, you're kind of change as throughout the history of the Egyptian kingdom. We even, just in the previous question, Benji's question, we see that what it meant to be a Pharaoh undertook some very interesting meanings because of Hatshepsut's rise to power. And so, originally, as Pharaoh had meant the divine kingship of a male ruler, we see that a lot of that had to kind of flux and adapt a little bit because of her term in that office, I guess.
So this is still BC, right? 15, no?
We are definitely still in BC.
Okay.
Another
1458 is BC, right?
Another interesting thing I wanted to mention, but really don't have too much to say,
Yes.
is that I think it is actually around this period, especially kind of near the beginning of these 3 chapters, that, or maybe even a little bit before that, but around this time was, I think, the time of Joseph and his period in Egypt.
Is that right?
Yeah, I think so.
was thinking about
Yeah.
Ken Shikov said Joseph married the daughter of a high priest of
Yeah.
Ron. On is the Middle Egypt. On is the region, but the priest was a priest for Ra. So
Yeah.
I just did some, research because reading with Noah inspired me. Man, just land on the scripture. So
Yeah.
it's crazy how it can convert together.
Well, that's the thing is the Hyksos, those peoples of the eastern regions
Eastern regions.
are, I guess, have some strong correlation with the Hebrew people
Oh.
in their involvement in the Egyptian empire or the
Oh.
kingdom of Egypt.
Seriously, oh wow.
And so when the Hyksos are mentioned, then it doesn't fully encompass. It involves peoples of the same region that the Hebrews came from.
Yeah.
And so a lot of that is still very unclear, and I don't think really anywhere in this book, although we haven't read it all, so I don't know, but
Yeah.
really nowhere in this book does he seem to mention
Biblical history.
in any biblical history, despite his interesting language uses that seem very biblical. Like even right now I'm on a page that the title is Holy of Holies, so like
Oh yeah.
it's obviously he's kind of confusing me a little bit
Yeah.
that he doesn't mention any of that, even in a speculative approach. But anyways, maybe he will later on,
Yeah.
particularly if we ever get to a point around the time that Moses was thought to be within or a part of the kingdom, which I would think would be when, as described in chapter 9 and before that,
Okay.
where it's talking about the expulsion of the Hyksos rulers. But this might have been, that itself may have been sometime before the time in which Moses led the Israel out of Egypt. Anyways, well, I guess we'll have to find out, so.
Yeah.
Okay, we can move on to Esther's question now.
I guess pretty much just like talked everything about what my question is. But it's, did the woman in Egypt have more rights than any other woman in that time period? So obviously, as we know, back then, pretty much women didn't have any rights. But I looked up and saw that in Egypt, the woman had pretty much the same rights as the men, which I thought was interesting. And we can see that there was the female king, which they were called, and what Noah went over about them making themselves seem more of males instead of female, like with the statue and the paintings in their tombs, they appeared as males. But I just thought it was kind of interesting in Egypt that they had the same rights, or almost the same rights as men, than anywhere else in the world where women really didn't have any rights.
Yeah, I would not at all be surprised that if women in the Egyptian kingdom, at least in that time, compared to any other culture, probably had or were the most comparatively privileged and respected compared to other cultures in which I think women had a very culturally low standing, because we see not only in
It's true. Yeah.
things were based very much despite as the kind of conundrum we saw with Hatshepsut, man, I never get it.
That quick.
Hatshepsut. Despite that, we see that the distinguishment is mainly found in class. So basically, if you were a ruler or a noble or a commoner,
Yeah.
farmer standing,
That's true.
that's where the distinguishing factor was found in this time and in this kingdom,
Yeah.
rather than on basis of gender. Now we see there also was there was perhaps a bit of a nationality distinguishment too. I think that's actually mentioned in one of these 3 chapters, where despite the fact that there was a really great blend of various cultures, like from south and the Nubians, and in the north the Hyksos peoples, those were all there was a great mixture in the Egyptian kingdom, though. Nonetheless, I think even around this time specifically, there was kind of a nationalistic rise of what it meant to be an Egyptian, which was kind of the impetus behind what we read in the last few chapters before these ones, in which certain rulers and leaders rose up to expel those Hyksos rulers. And even the beginning of the first one of these 3 chapters, we saw that Tutmos the first was, and I think Amun or whoever it was before him, were instrumental in also driving out the Nubians of the south, which was hinted at a little bit at Elijah's question as it concerned Kerma and different areas like those. So the history, of course, is still pretty complex, but because there's a lot of different peoples involved in the various regions. But
Yeah, only thing is they have one kind of people, not sure. And today's Egyptians actually is not ancient Egyptian at all,
right,
in a sense.
it's a blend of a lot of different, very ancient cultures.
Yeah, Egypt had a lot of changes.
Yeah.
We think it's the same culture. Actually not, because the people changed, and inevitably the culture morphs changed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did want to mention too in the final chapter we read, King Country. It has an interesting description of the sort of the government setup in the Egyptian kingdom that time. It's on page 226. He entitles this section Church and State. I think I don't know if Justin had gone into a bit of a description of that last time or the time before that or not. I feel like there had been a bit of a description there, but we see a little bit before that in 224 the high priest of Amun. His name was Minkaperassanim. Minkaperassanim.
Yeah, do it again.
224.
Do it again.
Minkaperassanim.
Oh, make it press. Make press.
He's used as a concurrent example, at least for this time we're looking at, or this period we're looking at, as a very influential and important leader figure, as a high priest. The religious station of ancient Egypt was almost completely unified with that of the rulership or the kingship. So we see, some of the responsibilities that Minkaperassanim had as the high priest was very much tied with and in line with that of the kingship. We see over here on page 226, it says, Temple and palace in ancient Egypt, the two institutions were inextricably intertwined and mutually reinforcing.
That's crazy.
As high priest, Minkaperassanib's primary duty was to bolster the monarchy ideologically and financially. So it goes into a bit of a description of that. In the next paragraph it says, while Minkaperassanib ensured that the temple of Amun-Ra and its priesthood remained loyal to the monarch, his colleague Rekhmira was tasked with an even greater responsibility, the smooth running of civilian administration throughout Upper Egypt. As southern vizier. So basically, a vizier is someone who represents someone who is an authority, and kind of acts as a steward or a administrator for that kingship. Rechmira exercised a combination of courtly, judicial, and administrative authority. So those are three very interesting offices that are in our country, for example, separated, but he represented all three of them. Hearing petitioners with a grievance against authorities, presiding as chief judge in important cases, and receiving daily briefings from other government ministers.
That's crazy.
In his own words, he was second only to the king. Rechmira, too, I thought that was interesting because Rechmira reminds me actually very much of Joseph.
Yeah.
Owed his exalted position more to influence than to innate ability, coming from a long line of viziers. In accordance with Egyptian concept of Me'at, which is both a god and almost like an ideological structure for the Egyptians, is similar to the Bible as it is for us in a way.
Yeah.
Truth, justice, and righteousness, which is what Me'at stands for.
Yeah.
The vizier was sworn to carry out his duties with impartiality.
Wow. That's crazy.
Interesting stuff.
I was listening their prince this morning, partiality, talk about as a translation on the God is not a God of partiality. He said, I don't like that word. Basically, he said the old King James translates the word called no respect of persons. And he described partiality has to do with the personal liking, preferences. But no respect person means I don't care you're rich or poor, you're good,
Yep.
high, low standing. So it's not personal feeling, So rather, it was God said, don't really worry about your social standing, identity. You deal with a person on a personal level in different ways. So, anyway, go ahead.
So yeah, it's
No, it's amazing how things line up with Joseph's life.
I know, yeah.
Yeah. Oh my God, that's terrible. Sorry. I mean, everywhere you can listen, learn things. Last time I was casually looking YouTube and said, hey, Israel's name was revealed in Egyptian monuments. So that's interesting. So I look at the monument. Didn't finish the thing there. And here we're reading says the Egyptians use a monument to commemorate their standing, whatever, campaigning. So
yeah.
Anyway, interesting.
Continuing, I found it interesting later in the same chapter, King and Country, a somewhat amusing example of someone who was not of any particular royal lineage, but who nonetheless found himself a very successful career in the kingdom. And also became almost hilariously conceited in his success, which is the character Quinamun. You guys remember reading about him? He was, I guess, the son to one of the milkmaids of the royal palace. So he eventually became an administration. He became, as it says here, the fourth member of a high-ranking quartet and Amenhotep II's chief steward. And so a little bit beyond that, it says, besides the fact, this is on 230. Besides the fact that he designed for himself an extravagant tomb in Thebes, he had some very interesting titles for himself. As they're described there on 231.
231? Okay, good.
Quinamun devised ever more elaborate formulations to vaunt his position, which we see, as we've seen, the Egyptians are very, very big on their titles.
Yeah, so is the Chinese. This is the old
They're very
culture.
big on their titles. So he called himself chief companion of the courtiers, overseer of overseers, leader of leaders, greatest of the great, regent of the whole land.
Seriously?
One who, if he gives any attention to anything in the evening, it is mastered early in the morning at daybreak.
Wow.
Doing right by the Lord of the two lands, giving satisfaction to the sovereign, inspiring the king with perfect confidence. And he says, the author says this is the most ludicrous of all. Heartily appreciated by Horus. That's almost a sacrilegious thing to do.
Sacrilegious, yeah. Well.
Or well, no, that would be that would be like almost an overly religious thing to do.
Yeah. Wow.
And even he led a bit of a double life, as it goes into the description here.
Oh, secret double.
And that he was similar almost in his clandestine surveillance of the king's court, making sure that the king stayed safe. He was similar to the secret service of
England.
Elizabeth in England.
Ah. Yeah,
that was kind of fun
England.
as well.
Elizabeth.
Drawing some parallels there.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Anyways, yeah.
Thank you, Noah.
But
Yeah, Elizabeth had to fight off the Pope. This guy, the first invention of W7 stories are from the spies from within churches. Anyway.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful book. I forgot who wrote it. Anyway.
Another interesting thing I wanted to mention before we closed was giving an interesting idea of kind of the mannerism of the court, or of the rulership in this dynasty at least.
Which page?
This is at 233. Especially as we see this last king here before it goes into the next chapter, Thutmose the Fourth. Who, remember, it made the distinguishment between he and I think another half brother. One was very studious and intellectual, but the future ruler himself, Thutmose the Fourth, was a very adventurous, almost wild character.
Like Aesop.
Yeah, very similar. It gives a good description here in 233. It says,
233. Okay.
the harsh and uncompromising style of education accurately reflected the exercise of power in ancient Egypt. The royal court, despite its luxury, was no place for effete intellectuals. Ambition, determination, resilience, and manly vigor. These were the qualities prized by the government machine, and the nursery sought to drum them into its pupils. So that was kind of a summary, a bit of a summary
Education
of the sort of educational system in Egypt in that time. So it was very much emphasized the manliness of kingship and what it meant to be a militaristic warrior, almost.
A young prince.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Amenhotep II, as well as I think his son Thutmose IV's life, is very much an example of that. The fruit of that education. Yeah. Anyways, that kind of concludes it for the day, I think.
Should we do the vocabulary real quick?
Yeah, we can take a look at that. Who did ungilded, the first one?
Me.
Why didn't you write a definition? Do you have one?
I put it on there and then I looked for the definition and it was like, wasn't showing up and I couldn't.
Then why didn't you change it?
Because I forgot. So that was kind of a.
That could be because it's not a very commonly used word at all. It's basically the opposite of gilded, which is to be kind of encased in some shiny substance, like almost gilded with gold. Is similar to a common expression, but ungilded would just be the opposite. So not gilded is what that means. I guess you don't remember where you had seen that word.
I don't see it
In
anywhere.
chapter 11, I think.
Okay.
I mean,
Anyways.
we never even looked at the vocabulary words with Justin.
Yeah, I don't remember doing that either. Who did autonomous?
Me.
That's a common word.
I don't care.
It's still
Not for me.
not a bad one.
Thought.
It's not a bad word.
Having the freedom to govern itself or control its own affairs.
I didn't know what that meant, so.
There were some regions and some peoples ruled by the ancient Egyptian empire, as we've seen, that probably desired their own autonomy from the Egyptian kingdom, like the Nubians, but because that's kind of been so far an age-old struggle between them and the Egyptians. And Egypt itself, during the time that the foreigners are occupying their land, required their own autonomy too. So that's an applicable word.
Autonomy.
Autonomy, yeah.
Autonomy.
And then who did prerequisite? Sorry about that. A thing that is required is a prior condition for something else to happen or exist. Prerequisite is a useful word. Yeah. I don't know where you saw that, so I don't know how to
Thank
contextually
you.
apply it.
Right.
We cuss
I
out.
understand.
And then, now this is a pretty good word for what we were reading. Militarism, the belief or desire of a government where people thought throughout a country
I forgot.
should maintain
Military
a
power.
strong military capability. So yes, we see that certainly, especially leading up to in the last rulers of the 18th dynasty here, they were very militaristic for sure, in the way that they both were educated and perceived their purpose and destiny as rulers. I think was a very much a militaristic way of rulership. Yeah. All right. I think that is it for today. I don't know what Justin is planning on us doing
Not like I'll get the email.
from here, but I'd very much suggest that we start on reading the next 3 chapters like last time as soon as possible. So make sure to have the next 3 chapters read by next week. The 3rd chapter will be going into the next section, but still make sure to read it. So 3 chapters.